wanted to review some important thoughts about composition that I think are relevant to really any drawing or art project that you might find yourself working on, but particularly to this project that you are starting on today. And so when we talk about composition, we're essentially really just talking about how the elements are arranged on the picture plane. And so I'm going to just review a few basic ideas about your paper's orientation. That's a decision that you're making. Perhaps you find using a viewfinder to be helpful in creating a composition, especially if you have a still life setup and you want to decide where all the elements will fall. We're going to talk a little bit about thumbnails. We're going to talk about your viewpoint that you, the artist, are deciding to position yourself in relationship to your drawing, the placement of the objects on that actual drawing plane, positive and negative space, and by extension, maybe a little bit of figure and ground relationship, and then whether your composition is open or closed. So perhaps some of these are very familiar to you, perhaps all of them are, perhaps none of them are. I'm just going to do a really quick review of all of them, and then I want you to make sure that you are thinking actively about all of these decisions as you start on your next big drawing. So the very first idea, such a basic idea, is what orientation is your paper? And when we talk about the picture plane, what are we talking about? Essentially, we're talking about that boundary, the edge of your drawing. So if you're working on a piece of paper where that edge is, of course, everything has a limitation with the drawing. It's not infinite. And then also that surface that it's on, right? That surface that you are making marks on. Both of those refer to your picture plane. And when you're working with usually a rectangular piece of paper, you can think about the paper being in a portrait orientation or a landscape orientation. And even if your paper is square, you might still refer to it as portrait if it's oriented a certain way, or landscape if it's oriented a certain way. For our purposes, let's just talk about a rectangular composition. And in that sense, when something is vertical, it's called a portrait. The vertical positioning of the picture plane is called a portrait. And when it is horizontal, it is called a landscape. And that is really because when we think of a landscape, we tend to think of a horizon. We tend to think of things being sort of sprawled out left to right. And when we think of a portrait, we tend to think top to bottom, right? So your very first choice is, do I want it to be portrait or landscape? Another tool that you might want to think about using as you start to work on your drawing is perhaps you want to use a viewfinder. And a viewfinder is simply a device that helps you locate the view you want to use for your drawing. And we can see that very clearly in this image on the right. Someone is holding up a viewfinder, and you can see that really frames whatever the person is looking at really nicely so they can see what can fit into the composition. A lot of times we think, oh, that'll fit in, and when we hold a viewfinder up, we see it in fact falls outside of our frame. You may already have a viewfinder. If you don't have a viewfinder, you could use a piece of light cardboard. Maybe you have cardboard from like a cracker box or something like that. I wouldn't try cutting a viewfinder out of corrugated cardboard. So like those Amazon boxes, that gets a little bit messy. You want something that has like a little bit heavier weight than a piece of printer paper so that you can actually hold it up and it won't flop over. But you don't want it to be so thick that it's really difficult to cut. And you would cut that with your X-Acto knife. Now, we tend to cut viewfinders to match the proportions of the 18 by 24 piece of paper. So a lot of times I will have students cut a 3" by 4" viewfinder in class. And that's a pretty easy viewfinder to cut out. And it's 3" by 4" because proportionally that matches 18" by 24", which is the size of the paper that we use. You want it to have the same dimensions as the paper you're drawing on. If it doesn't, that's not really that helpful, because if something fits into your viewfinder, it may or may not fit into your paper. So we can see that the way that your viewfinder is shaped will indicate the shape that your drawing has, right? The proportions that your drawing has. We can see that here. This is square, so this is square. Couple of other ideas that I think are important to review and think about is your thumbnail sketch. So one of the steps in most drawing projects will always include a thumbnail sketch. And a thumbnail sketch is simply a planning sketch, a sketch that helps you really brainstorm about your composition. And we can see some really beautiful examples of that here. And you can really see that the way that the artist plays with how far away they are from the objects, how high or low they are with the objects, how spread out the objects are, how even the value pattern can start to move your eye around the composition, how something being portrait or landscape can really change the read of the composition, how cutting off certain objects versus other objects, all of that really changes the way your drawing looks. And so the thumbnail works to help you do some of that brainstorming work in a very small and quick way before you move over to your paper and find halfway through that you don't like the decisions that you've made. A couple of important points to think about. This is actually from a text about comics and drawing like animations and comic art. So a little bit different than what we're working on, but I think the content is still extremely important to the decision making that we make as artists. This particular image is about the idea of a viewpoint, right? And that viewpoint that you choose can really influence the viewer's perception of your piece, right? So if we look just at these different images that we see here, we can see on the far left, this figure is looming above. We really feel like we're below. We see next to it, we feel like we're above. We see on the third one, looking through a window. All of these decisions really change the emotion and experience that a viewer has. So some of what you may want to think about is there some interesting perspective that you can put yourself in relationship to your drawing's content? Is there some kind of filter or space that you want us to view it from? As creative as you want to be, I say go for it. I think it could make the drawing even more interesting. Another thing that you may already know about are these kind of mathematical ideas around how to place things on your paper. One is the rule of thirds, the other is the golden mean. Both have slightly different mathematics about where objects get placed, but essentially they're both interested in spreading the composition out in a specific way. And both tend to say, think about balance. Think about how the elements are balanced across your composition. You can see that there are key places that are not at the very far edge of the paper plane where you might want to place an object of interest in your composition. You don't want to put things directly down the middle and split it sort of like in this way that creates this really strong sense of imbalance. You really want to constantly be thinking about how your composition is spread out across the entire picture plane. Another important idea that actually really relates to that is this idea of positive and negative space. And positive space is just the thingness of your drawing, the figure, the object, the subject, that thing that is making up your drawing. The negative space are those kind of empty areas around the positive form, right? So you may have seen this idea illustrated with an image like this. We have like the ram on the left side, that is the positive space, and here on the right side, this black all illustrates a negative space. It's not nothing exactly, but it's not the subject of the drawing, right? And a lot of times we want to think about what is the balance between our positive and negative space. If this were all filled with empty white space that related to the concept of that being the positive space, it might be a little bit chaotic and overwhelming. We can see there's actually a nice balance here between positive and negative space. Just another illustration that explains this idea through chairs, one of the great subjects that we use to illustrate positive and negative space. Related to the idea of positive and negative space is the concept of the figure-ground relationship. And figure-ground relationship basically allows us to recognize the borders and boundaries between the elements in a composition, right? It's not all just like the same depth of space. There are some things that are foregrounded, there are some things that are in the background, there are some things that are in the middle ground, some things that are more important than other. The figure-ground relationship helps us understand this. And figure does not necessarily mean a body, and ground does not necessarily mean the earth. Of course, you could make a drawing where those are the figure and the ground in a figure ground relationship, but a lot of times it can be even something more abstract than that, right? The figure is the object or foregrounded element, not necessarily all in the foreground. And the ground is the space or the volume around, between, or behind those forms. So you can see how it can relate to this idea of positive and negative space. And like I said, it could just be a figure, right, walking down a catwalk. It could also be something really abstract. This still is the figure, and this kind of beige space behind is the ground. Another important decision that I want you to think really actively about, because I think this plays a huge role in how your drawing is perceived, is the idea of whether you have an open form or a closed form composition. A lot of times we don't even necessarily notice when we're looking at something whether the drawing or the artwork that you're looking at has open or closed form composition. It just sort of like washes over us, and we are looking at the drawing and appreciating it. But this is a really pivotal decision that you can make. And this basically determines whether we see a complete or only partial view of a scene. And it really changes the way drawings feel, right? So here on the left side, we have an open form composition. And on the right side, we have more of a closed form composition. And what do I mean by that? An open form composition is when an object or subject either breaks the edges of the format, so the edges of the picture plate, or pulls the viewer's eye off of it. And that can create a more casual or informal feeling. And usually it involves some sort of cropping of the subject and maybe a more unique point of view, right? So this is a painting by Alex Katz. And we can see what looks sort of like feet moving through the air, but we're at this extremely unique perspective. We're kind of low down. Very rarely are we just looking at people's feet straight on. That's more of like an animal's point of view, a cat or a dog's point of view, right? And we're also getting the heel cut off on the right side, the toe cut off on the left. There's a sense of movement. Our mind sort of starts to wonder and wander. Where is this figure going? What's the story? Yada, 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 right? So this is open form. It continues beyond the edge of the composition. You could say that this Wayne Thiebaud piece that we saw earlier also has an open form composition, right? These glasses are cut off on the edge. We're not sure how long it goes on for. Perhaps there's a whole world beyond here that we are curious about. So again, if we go back to this example up here on the left, this is an illustration of a protest, and one gets the sense that this goes on and on and on, right? Like this crowd goes on, the city goes on, there's this energy that goes on and on. A closed form composition can have a different effect. Closed form composition is when the viewer's eye is led back into the picture and not outward as much. It creates a formal and more structured appearance, potentially, of course, not necessarily, but that you have a little bit more potential for that. And it usually contains what you might call a complete scene, right? We're not so much wondering, hey, what's over here, just out of the picture's edge. We're like, I think I get what's happening here, and I'm content sort of using all this information to create my story, right? So you could say this is more of a closed form composition, right? The artist has created pretty simply through pretty simple means the illusion of a room, just this like kind of diagonal differentiation in value between the dark wall and the grayscale floor. And then this painting that draws our eye, right? And furthermore, within the painting, there's this kind of mesmerizing, like spiraling effect into the center. That's just kind of a fun addition. But this really draws our eye in, right? We're like getting pulled into this. We're not so curious about outside of it. We're just kind of focusing in. And this could happen even, not necessarily with a still life or something that is so immediately legible, but it can happen with something, again, slightly more abstract, right? This is just this shape that sort of feels flat, but also like it has dimension, like it has form, because of the way that the value is being used to kind of create the rounding of the forms. And again, this is really drawing our eye inwards, right? We're not so curious about what's happening outside of it. This is a closed form composition. we're content with the edges. We don't need to go beyond it. So really think about what's more interesting to you, what serves your purpose, your concept more strongly, right? One of the things you'll be doing is working on on thumbnails, and your thumbnails should really look at all of these different ways of thinking about composition. Try to go outside of your immediate comfort zone or your immediate concept idea. Really let your mind start to think, hey, what if I zoom in? What if I zoom out? What if I have negative space here? What if I have a sort of strange vantage point? Really start to think about, even with something as simple as these drawings of shells, we see all of these different drawings feel quite different, right? So really try to explore for yourself. This is, again, not really the same content as the drawing that we're making, but I think it really perfectly illustrates how drastic your compositional choices on the picture plane, where you are thinking about scale, where you are thinking about perspective and placement. Like some of these are sort of more of an aerial view, some of them are an eye level view, some of them are very far away, some of them are long, some of them are short. You can see just how incredibly different these onions in a bowl look depending on the decisions that you make. So remember, composition, a big part of this project, one of the things that you are really making active, informed, artistic decisions about.